Welcome to Retirement GPS, navigated by Zynergy, your roadmap to a secure and confident retirement. Each week, we explore strategies, stories, and planning frameworks designed to help you navigate the complexities of life after work. From tax planning to investments, income strategies to risk management, our goal is to give you the clarity and confidence you need to make informed decisions. But retirement isn't just about the numbers. It's also about lifestyle, purpose, and peace of mind. We're here to guide you through both the financial details and the personal dimensions of this next chapter. Let's chart today's course.
Hello, and welcome back to episode 27 of the Retirement GPS podcast. I'm Ryan Zaharchik, certified financial planner, president of Zynergy Retirement Planning, and your host. And I'm here with, of course, the man, the myth, the legend, my associate planner, Zane Belsack. What's up, Zane?
Hey, Ryan, it's great to be here. I know I always say it's great to be here, but it's especially great to be here because it is 10 degrees outside. So I'm,
Absolutely.
And by here, I mean in this room.
In this room, where the heat is prevalent and you're not digging a ditch outside in the freezing cold, right? That's what it's all about. Today, we are going to talk about, really, does it make sense for you to pay off your mortgage or keep your mortgage in retirement? And it's a topic that we get a lot, and we're really going to be focusing the next couple episodes on getting your questions answered. They're the questions that listeners have been asking us, writing in, also questions we get a lot from the people that we do planning for. And we will make sure we touch on these topics so that you are really comfortable in thinking through the decision, because the three topics we're about to discuss over the next three episodes, they're really targeted towards customization. There's no right answer. A lot of rules of thumb that go around in financial planning that say you should do this or you should do that, but they don't know your specific situation. So we're actually going to give you thought models that you can walk through to think about your specific situation. Does this make sense for me? And that's what today is all about.
Now, I think this question in particular is really important, and I want to say, honestly, it's something that's mentioned almost every time we meet with someone new. Should I A, pay off my mortgage, or should I B, invest with you? And that's really a question that we want to answer for you as a fiduciary.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It's always a conflict of interest for us, so we always tell people that. But in this case, our thought model we go through, because the truth is we like to see the mortgage paid off in retirement. We're going to help you think about that. So the goals really are to help you decide whether to eliminate your mortgage, keep it, or decide on a path that really is right for you. And what we're going to cover today is really the pros and cons of paying off the mortgage or keeping it. Any tax traps related to it, because taxes are certainly something that we need to consider as a part of this, and a practical payoff strategy. So let me start with a story. And it's a relatively quick story. The story of Carol and Jeff, who were newly retired. They had a 4.25% mortgage, so 4.25% on their mortgage, which is certainly not a high rate, but not an extremely low rate either. It fell right in between. That ran them about $1,300 a month. All right. They had a pretty decent balance on it, a little less than $100,000. And Carol really loved the idea of getting the mortgage paid off. In fact, that's what she always had dreamed, is that we were going to retire and get the mortgage paid off. However, Jeff realized that his interest rate was relatively low compared to the markets and the rest of the world. And he thought, I'd like to keep the cash, keep it invested, and we'll just pay the mortgage off over time. So we talked through really two paths for them. The first one is using taxable savings. So expenses would be dropped by over $1,000 a month. Now remember, when you pay off your mortgage, you're not losing your property taxes, you're not losing your insurance. Those things are staying as long as you own a house. But we will lose the principal and interest on the mortgage, and that's really what we're looking for. The other option is to keep the loan and invest the cash, potentially higher long-run value, because we might get a better return over time, and we would expect to get a better return over time, but there's certainly no guarantee. But with market swings and having that same fixed payment due. Here's the problem, is that after we talked about it, they went home and thought about it, and then they almost went out and just decided to pay it off, and they were going to use their IRA money, which was not part of our conversation. They were going to take a big lump sum from their IRA, $100,000 from their IRA, and it would have spiked their ordinary income dramatically over what we had expected and what we had calculated, and it would have increased their Social Security taxes. We risked Medicare IRMAs, so that IRMA plus-ups on your Medicare, which we've talked about in past episodes, would have been an issue. I talked them off the ledge, and I said, basically, we are going to be pulling this from a taxable investment account. I agree that we should pay it off, but let's do that from a taxable account so we don't have that and trigger those.
And I'm just thinking out loud, there's a Medicare look back, right, for IRMAs?
There is. So it's always 2 years. So Medicare IRMA is always going to look back 2 years. If they had drawn that IRA money to pay off their mortgage and it triggered a Medicare IRMA, they wouldn't see that for 2 years, and it would have lasted for 1 year to represent the year that they had that higher income.
So that might affect, retirement savings, retirement contributions even.
Yeah, all kinds of things. Roth conversions, all the different
Yep.
strategies that we look at when we're doing retirement planning. And it would have been certainly problematic. It's not ideal, considering that they did have the money in a taxable investment account. Let's talk about our defaults, which are things that we at Zenergy lean towards. Again, this is case by case. Financial planning is not a rule of thumb. Financial planning is a case by case analysis of what the particular situation is. But in general, at Zenergy, we do have a bias towards paying the mortgage off. We like to have a mortgage paid off in retirement if we can help. So we start with that bias is, hey, can we get this mortgage paid off practically and safely from a tax standpoint? Does it make sense? In many cases, if it doesn't make sense, for whatever reason, maybe the mortgage is too large. I've had people retire with $250,000 mortgage, and they just didn't have that in taxable accounts. It would have all had to come from IRAs. They would have had to draw $350,000 or so to get the $250,000, right? Because you got to pay your taxes on the $350,000, and it would have triggered all these other like massive taxes, higher rates, and IRMAs, and all these things, which we didn't want to have happen. Because that didn't make sense, what we talked about at the time, and this was, by the way, pre-COVID, we talked about actually refinancing and spreading the mortgage out over a longer period of time, because I think at the time they had about 9 years left on the mortgage, and we said cash flow is our largest priority. Let's spread that out over a longer period of time. We spread it out to actually a 20-year term mortgage at roughly the same rate, and their cash flow now was at a much better place. That's a little bit harder to do, that strategy, because interest rates have gone up so much and so many people are dealing with low rate mortgages. So if you're locked into a 2 3/4, 3.5% rate, refinancing to a 6% rate doesn't seem really palatable.
So you're really looking at these two avenues, whether it's cash flow, how it affects your inflows and your outflows, versus your interest rate. How much are you paying for your mortgage payment?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are avenues that are always going to be like the two core avenues. And it actually gives us our third default, which is if you do have a really low rate. And we actually just sat down with a gentleman yesterday, completed a financial plan, who had a rate of 2.75%, had about 3 more years on it. And we had talked about paying off the mortgage, only $80,000 left over the next 3 years at 2.75. And we both agreed, like, that's a situation where we actually could do an arbitrage. Now, what is an arbitrage? I'll define that for those of you who don't know what that is. Arbitrage is basically having two separate investments that perfectly offset each other, but would actually provide a risk-free return. Okay, so in this example, he actually sold a bond when he got a mortgage, right? That's the equivalent of selling a bond. So he's got a loan at 2 3/4% with $80,000 left. If he had the $80,000 sitting in his savings account and wanted to pay it off, he could take that $80,000, put it into a high yield CD, high yield money market, high yield anything that gets him, let's just say 3.5%, 4% right now in today's world. Treasury would do something comparable, and he could actually make money while he gradually pays off the mortgage over time. So the differential of the 2 3/4% versus the 4%, obviously there's some tax considerations which we look at, but if you can arbitrage, i.e. take a risk-free investment, and it has to be risk-free or it's not an arbitrage, right? Because if you put your money at risk, then risk losing it. So that's not arbitrage. But if we can put in a risk-free investment and offset it with a risk-free rate on your mortgage, and we can have a differential that's in our favor, that's a positive arbitrage that we want to take advantage of. So we can pocket the difference there, and that's a good strategy in today's world because so many people are locked in at low rates, and they can get a higher rate out in the investment community.
And is that dependent on the balance of the mortgage, or does that kind of vary? Is that really varying situation to situation?
It always is varying situation to situation, but I don't think it has a lot to do with the balance of the mortgage. I think the answer would be the same if it were the $300,000 mortgage and he had $300,000 sitting in savings or checking ready to pay it off. We would probably say the same thing. Let's arbitrage it until it doesn't make sense. Because what happens is your rate on your mortgage stays the same, but the rates on your savings change as interest rates change. So you might get 4% today, and in 6 months you might get 3.5%, and then in another 6 months you might get 3.25%, and by the time you then account for taxes, it doesn't make sense anymore. We really need to look at, does it make sense on a case-by-case basis? And it's not something we're locked into. The great thing about arbitrage, unless you're buying a 10-year treasury or something where you're locking yourself down, we can continue to make adjustments as we go. Let's talk about the case for paying off our mortgage. First of all, we lower our baseline expenses, fewer forced withdrawals during market drops. It allows us to manage our expenses. We talk a lot, and we're going to get to that in our next episode. We're going to talk about the gap, finding the gap between what is your guaranteed income sources and what is your needs in retirement, your spending in retirement. The difference is your gap, and we make up for that with our investment distributions. The more we can reduce that gap, the safer your portfolio. If we can pay off a mortgage now, we can dramatically reduce that gap. And that can be really helpful, especially during really bad market environments where you might feel uncomfortable and want to cut spending. It's easy to cut discretionary spending. It's hard to cut when you have to pay your mortgage. You can't do that.
Yeah, and even with Carol and Jeff, what was it, $1,300 a month? Having that out of sight, out of mind is a huge amount of money to now be able to use for discretionary.
Yeah, absolutely. And now you have the freedom to do different things with that money, especially when you're talking about a relatively small amount, $100,000, to free up that $1,300, which works out to roughly $15,000 a year in free cash flow. Guaranteed return, like roughly the case for paying it off is we know that we're roughly getting a guaranteed return that's equal to our mortgage rate after tax. Now, tax is an important consideration, right? Because we can only write off our mortgage interest if we are itemizing our taxes, our tax deductions. If we're taking the standard deduction, there is no mortgage interest. Important point, most people are under the impression that they're getting a mortgage interest deduction no matter what, but that's not the case if you're taking the standard deduction. For the last couple of years, most people that we do taxes for are taking standard deduction. And when I say most, it's about 90%. Even here in New Jersey with high property taxes and high income taxes for the state, which are both deductible, a lot of people still didn't hit the standard deduction level if they itemized. So the mortgage interest is really not deductible. With the one big beautiful bill change, we now know that the SALT tax has dramatically increased, or the SALT tax deduction has dramatically increased, which is a huge value for all of us. And especially if you're here in New Jersey or in the Northeast or in California in high tax states. And if you're a higher income earner, these are all really great things. So you may be itemizing this year more likely than in the past, which means you may be deducting your mortgage interest. But just remember, it's not a given, right? That's not a guarantee. So when you're looking at your guaranteed return, make sure you realize it's after tax. Sequence risk control. This is a little bit of a technical term that we use in financial planning, which I'm not going to dive too much into. We can get into it when we talk about distributions in the next episode. But sequence risk is my average may be what I expect. Like I may get an average rate of return of 8%, which is fantastic. But if the order of returns is not the way I expect, meaning the sequence isn't what I need. As an example, if I have negative 20% for 3 years, the very early on in my retirement, and then positive 40% for 3 years much later in my retirement, I could run out of money before I get to those positive 40% returns. So sequence of returns is important. Averages are nice, but without understanding variability in those averages, we call it standard deviation. It's the old adage that if my head is in the freezer and my feet are in the oven, on average, I'm comfortable. Average is nice, but it doesn't tell the whole story. So we need to make sure that we're accounting for that risk, and having fewer bills will actually help with that risk. So paying off your mortgage really will help with having a bad couple of years early on in retirement. And then, of course, cash flow return. A mortgage near the end of its return, this is like something unique that a lot of people don't think about. But a mortgage near the end of its term, meaning if I have a 30-year fixed mortgage, the last 3 years, I may have a pretty significant monthly payment, even though the balance is very low. So usually a year fixed at 3.5%, the principal and interest are $2,245. If you multiply that out by 12, you're looking at somewhere in the range, I didn't do the math exactly, but it's somewhere in the range of about $25,000 a year. That's $25,000 a year of cash flow going out the door in principal and interest. But in the final years of the mortgage, so let's say there's 2 years left, the balance is going to be, say, roughly $50,000, right? So the $50,000 balance on our mortgage, there's 2 years left. We could pay that off in a lump, and that $50,000 frees us up about $25,000 a year in cash flow. So the return on cash flow is massive, at least for those 2 years, and can be really positive no matter what the interest rate is. If the interest rate's really low and you can arbitrage it, maybe it's worth it. It's worth keeping it, but it does make sense to pay it off if you have a big monthly payment at your very tail end of that mortgage.
Now I'm thinking, because you were saying the positive cash flow is such an important thing to consider, having that $25,000 that you could now move from a 3.5 mortgage into what, like a 6 or 7% investment, that's a huge win.
It's a huge win. They're not apples to apples. The 3.5 is something that's guaranteed. We know we're paying the 3.5. The 6 to 7 is something we hope and expect we're going to get, but certainly no guarantee. If you made that move in 1999, 2000, you were extremely disappointed 10 years later. You just have to be careful. That's not an arbitrage. That is reaching for a return and giving up a guaranteed type return. It's the same logic of I don't want to lock in my bonds and buy bonds at 4% when I can get 7 or 8% in the market. Yes, I can get 7 to 8% over time, but I'm also going to have to sit through a lot of volatility, and there's no guarantee I'm going to get that return in my time frame. But that's something that we just need to keep in mind. And then the last benefit of paying it off is peace of mind. And frankly, sometimes just being able to sleep at night knowing I don't have a mortgage is a huge value add.
That's got to be a great feeling.
I know, I'm not there. Someday it will be, but that's really the goal, is to get there so that you can put your head on the pillow at night and just be comfortable. My hope is that if you had the money sitting in savings and then you had the mortgage to equal each other, that would be the same type of feeling, but not necessarily the case. If peace of mind, that peace of mind is really important to you, then it's hard to quantify that. It's hard to say I want to get a 1% arbitrage and make an extra $1,000 a year on my $100,000 mortgage. Probably a better night's sleep is worth that $1,000 a year. Let's talk about the case for keeping it. Why would I keep my mortgage in retirement when the time comes? Number one is liquidity liquidity preservation. Just want to make sure that just because we get the house paid off, if we use all of our taxable money, if we have to dip into IRA, like having access to liquidity if an emergency comes up, or something a lot of people forget is an investment opportunity, right? There's an investment opportunity that comes up that we didn't see coming. Let's just say there's a big correction and you've got a lot of extra liquidity and you might want to put money into the market during that correction to invest it. Those are things that if you're house rich but cash poor, you don't have the opportunity to do those things. Potential opportunity cost. As you mentioned before, we talked about arbitrage, which is of course a guarantee. And then there's going out the risk curve, right? So there's taking some risk and putting money into a diversified portfolio, trying to get 7, 8, 9% rate of return when I'm only paying 3.5% on my mortgage. And of course, that opportunity cost can be huge if it does happen to be a good period during the time that the last 3 years, if you would have done it, you would have had a huge home run. Timing, of course, is important, but that can be a huge opportunity cost for sure. And then where are we pulling it from? Making sure that we're managing the tax nuances of it. And if we have to pull it from an IRA to get it paid off, how does that affect other things? And we already talked about that in our example. So things like IRMA, things like tax brackets, our tax on our Social Security benefits, these are all things that we really need to think through before we pull from a pre-tax account that triggers a taxable event.
So you mentioned house rich, cash poor, and I'm just curious, why or where does keeping liquidity actually turn into unnecessary risk?
Really there's not a lot of risk to liquidity unless you have massively excessive liquidity. It's getting off onto a different topic of emergency reserve, and we have a lot of people, we recommend a certain amount of emergency reserve, which is something typically we'll talk about, but for retirees, it's about 12 months. We like to say people have about a year's worth of expenses in liquid cash. Any more than that is just a trade-off of opportunity costs. Yep. It's not that there's a tremendous amount of risk per se. It's just that if you're getting 3.5% in your savings account or 4% in your savings account, and the market's yielding 7% over time, you get 3% on whatever that dollar amount is that you're missing out on. That's your opportunity cost that you're losing. And for some people, they'd rather have a little extra cash to be safe. But I don't want to get too far off on emergency reserve to get off topic. But that would be the reason why you just don't want to have too much cash.
And we have an episode on that.
Yep, and we have an episode on that too, so you can check it out in our library. And the last case to keep your mortgage and not pay it off is just for flexibility. It does give you a little bit more, like we talked about, their opportunity costs. You might have a big housing project that comes up that you need some cash for. You might have a big gift. It's just easier to fund things like travel. Having cash can create a lot of flexibility. That actually creates value in time under these various things. So flexibility can be valuable for sure. Now let's talk a little bit about taxes and make sure that we're doing this the right way, because like we talked about in our example with Carol and Jeff, funding from the wrong source can create problems. So we've already talked about pulling it from pre-tax accounts. I'm not going to beat that dead horse. Just think about that before we just go and willy-nilly pull $100,000 or $200,000 from our IRA to pay off our mortgage. Taxable accounts are often cleaner. These are your brokerage accounts that are after tax. They're not pre-tax deferred, so no 401ks, no IRAs, no simple plans. However, you can have other issues. We sometimes sit down with people that have their taxable investment accounts and they've been holding Apple since 1997 and it's up like 10,000%, and they're just like, I don't know what to do with that. It's a different problem for sure, but just liquidating that and going to pay off your mortgage creates the same sort of tax problem that you would have by pulling it from an IRA. So we just want to be sensitive to where are we pulling it from. We typically don't want to pull it from a Roth account. Not that we never would pull it from a Roth account, but especially if the Roth account is significant, you've been saving in it for a long time. But these Roth accounts are so valuable because they grow tax-free, essentially. They're left tax-free to your heirs. Even if you do take the money, they don't trigger IRMAs, they don't trigger additional Social Security taxes, they don't put you in higher tax brackets. They're like the golden goose of retirement planning, and they just keep laying golden eggs. And we want to make sure we try to preserve that. So I really am loath to take paying off a mortgage out of a Roth account. Doesn't mean we'll never do it, but we really need to look at the circumstances and make sure that if it's a small Roth account, I would never do it. If it's a very large Roth account that has been compounding over time, and if it's $1 million and we're going to pull $50,000, we might consider doing that. And remember that from a tax standpoint, that most retirees, at least up until this point, have been taking the standard deduction, and you don't overvalue the mortgage interest that you may not actually be deducting. You may say, I don't want to pay off my mortgage because I don't have a tax deduction. Guess what? You never really had a tax deduction anyway because you've been taking the standard deduction.
With huge taxable accounts, and I know you suggested perhaps if you have a correct balance for it, paying off the mortgage from your taxable account, it's just something to consider the capital gains attached with that, right?
Sure. Yeah, and that's what we talked about with that Apple stock. You just always want to make sure that you're including that as part of your calculus, that there's some gains there. Let's talk about liquidity. Make sure that that is maintained because we don't want to pull, as you talked about before, we don't take all of our liquidity out and pull so much cash that there's nothing left. It's really important that we're keeping at least 6 to 12 months in emergency reserves, especially if you're retired. And we definitely don't want to see that you're going to pull all of that to pay off your mortgage. If you think you can build it back up over the next few months, then we might talk about maybe taking it down from 12 months to 6 months and then just build it right back up over a few months with the savings from the mortgage. But we would look at that pretty closely. I'm not a big fan of that. I also think if you do pay off your mortgage and you get that removed and now you have this large asset in our location, this area in New Jersey, a lot of people that we work with, $800,000, $1 million houses, completely paid off. That's a lot of liquidity tied up into a house. It probably makes sense to get a HELOC, a home equity line of credit, a couple $100 with your local bank. You can just apply for it. It'll go against your house. If you get a $100,000 HELOC, they give you a checkbook. You can write a check against the HELOC as you need it. It just is a line of credit that stays open, and it's a fallback emergency reserve. But it gives you the ability to tap that home equity if an emergency, if something big were to come up that you might need. And it's typically something we recommend just to be able to tap that mortgage.
I've heard of the term HELOC, and I know that there's something also called a reverse mortgage. I'm assuming we could honestly probably do another episode on a reverse mortgage, how complicated it is. But
yeah, it's a great question. A reverse mortgage is definitely outside of the scope of this conversation, but it's a tool to access the equity in your home as well. A lot of nuances to that, which would get us really off track on this conversation, but it's something we can talk about in the future. It's a good episode for the future, so look out for a reverse mortgage episode. Let's talk about special situations. So what are some situations that are a little bit unique? First of all, if you have a really high interest rate loan, if you got your mortgage in the last couple of years, really leans you, and if you have the opportunity to pull the cash from the right place to pay it off, it really leans you towards paying it off. If I see somebody in retirement with a 7% mortgage or so, we really look to see if we can get that paid off 6-7%. It's very hard it's impossible to arbitrage right now, and it's very hard to even outpace it with your investment returns. Yeah, you might get a 7 or 8. I think most of our people last year were getting 10, 11, 12+% returns, but those are rare, and that's not what we expect to average out over time. If you have an ultra low rate loan, so that's the sub 3.5%, then I would really strongly encourage you to keep it and try to arbitrage it. Take a look at that. If you're near RMD age, so if you're getting to the point where today's world is 73 to 75, you have to take those required minimum distributions from your IRAs and you're thinking about paying off your mortgage, think about how that's going to impact your taxes with new RMDs coming, how that's going to affect your Social Security taxation, your IRMA, those types of things will all come into play. It's just going to be more income in those years. If you can get it paid off before IRMA comes, that's really more ideal. And if you have big near-term expenses, things like a roof repair coming up, if you have a car or wedding, certainly you can prioritize those things. Make sure you have enough liquidity before you consider paying off your mortgage. One last strategy that we do talk about with people where they have that, say, $100,000 balance, and we know we want to get it paid off. We just don't want to trigger. It's got to come from an IRA. We just don't want to trigger those big taxes. We pay it off in small chunks. It's kind of like bite-sized pieces, maybe over 2 or 3 year period. So we know we're going to have it paid off very soon. We're just not going to do it all at once. And it just so happened last year was a great example. We had somebody we started working with in August, and they wanted to pay off the mortgage. And what we decided to do was we were going to pay it off over 3 years. So effectively what we did, and this was what I thought was really cool, because it had to come from an IRA, is we drew, just to say it was a $100,000 mortgage, we drew the $33,000 at the end of 2025. We just drew another $33,000 in January of 26, and then we're going to draw the final balance in January of 27 to get it completely paid off. I don't even think it'll be $33,000 based on her payments, because she has been like hitting the principal. We're probably looking at a $25,000 mortgage or less by the time we go to actually pay off the balance. Kind of food for thought. It's a cool way to get money out of an IRA and do it gradually over time.
Yeah, you're not really taking those huge bites, taking it all out at once. You're taking those, I guess the right way to word it is bites big enough that it works for the person involved.
Yeah. And that's why this is always case by case. We're always looking at the individual situation and how we can manage it. A few things, let's talk about some action steps, some things that you can do to get this moving for you. Number one, compare rates. So take a look at the after-tax mortgage rate. Make sure you know how you're filing your taxes. And you may even want to wait, if you are thinking about it, wait until you file your taxes this year, because with the one big beautiful bill change, you may be itemizing when in the past you've been taking the standard deduction. Make sure you know your after-tax mortgage rate versus a realistic risk-adjusted return. We say risk-adjusted because, as Zane mentioned, you can take that money and put it in a diversified portfolio stock market, get 7-8%, but you have to adjust to the risk, right? We have to understand that there's risk associated with that. Next is do a cash test. So take a look, do I have enough emergency reserves? If I'm retired, do I have 12 months of cash and savings for just such an occasion? And do I have big liquidity needs coming up? Third, take a look at the tax impact, right? So where would I pull that money from, and how would that be taxed, and how would that affect me in other aspects? If I'm retiring young and I'm 61, 62, I'm not yet worried about IRMAs, right? I've got time on that because there's a 2-year look back, so my income doesn't affect me until age 63. I may not be collecting Social Security yet, so there's no impact there. We can take a look at those things. Stress check. So how important is it for you to get the mortgage paid off so that you can sleep at night? And that's certainly something that's important. And then lastly, the cash flow return. Do I have a $30,000 mortgage that if I get it paid off saves me $2,000 a month? That's a huge cash flow return that we can manage right now and get cleaned up for you. The key takeaways here, Zane, which we want our listeners to understand, is that there's no universal answer. This is a process. You have to look at your individual situation. You have to look at what the interest rate landscape looks like and decide what is the right answer for you this year and for the future. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode. Hopefully you got some good information out of it. If you did, make sure that you hit the like button, follow our podcast, share it with someone that you think might find it helpful, that is going through the same questions and going through the same things that you're dealing with. We always ask, leaving a review is really helpful. If you could leave us a 5-star review, I'd appreciate it. If you plan to leave us a 1-star review, just forget about it. You don't have to leave the review. You can avoid that.
Just write it down somewhere. I don't know.
Just write it down. You can write us a strongly worded letter. How about that? And don't forget to visit our blog on Zenergy's website, www.zenergyretirement.com. And we've got our mile markers blog where each podcast episode we actually write a blog about so that you can have everything we just talked about in writing and have it all broken down for you. We really appreciate you joining us. Keep learning, keep planning.
Thank you for listening to Retirement GPS, navigated by Zenergy. To explore today's topic further, visit our blog Mile Markers at zenergyretirement.com/blog, where we offer detailed strategies, examples, and downloadable tools to support your retirement journey. Follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook at Zenergy Retirement Planning for weekly insights, checklists, and planning reminders. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe, leave a 5-star review, and share it with someone planning for their future. Until next time, keep navigating toward a confident retirement. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended as investment, legal, or tax advice. Listeners should consult their own financial, tax, and legal advisors before making any decisions. Zenergy Retirement Planning is a registered investment advisor located in Red Bank, New Jersey.